It's like the Tacoma Little Theater or something, playing with like Johnny and those guys. The first time I heard that guy, I was in love with him. It was just amazing.
I think that it changes for me all the time.
Everyone who gets close to Jerry Cantrell eventually gets asked the same question. What really happened with Layne Staley? And for 30 years, Jerry Cantrell said as little as possible. He'd look away, take a breath, and give you just enough to fill a headline. But now, at 60 years old, older than Layne ever got to be, he's finally saying, doesn't just confirm the rumors. It reframes them entirely. It is a story about two men who were so deeply fused that when one of them died, the other had to rebuild himself from zero. The evidence has always been there in his silence, and one album nobody talked enough about. Stay with us, because what Jerry Cantrell has confirmed is more complicated and far more revealing than any rumor ever gave it credit for being. Broken kids in a rehearsal space. Jerry Cantrell had just lost his mother. 3 weeks after she died, he went to see a band called Alice in Chains perform at a small theater in Tacoma, Washington. He didn't know anyone there. He wasn't chasing music or opportunity. He was just trying to get through the day without feeling like everything was falling apart. Grief has a way of making the world feel distant, like you're present, but not really part of anything. Then the music started, and something cut through that fog. On stage was Layne Staley. There was a rawness to his voice that didn't feel polished or rehearsed. It felt lived in. There was power, but also something fragile underneath it. It didn't just sound good. It felt real. And for Jerry, in that moment, that was enough to hold on to. A few months later, they met at a party in Seattle. Life hadn't suddenly improved for Jerry. He was still broke, still trying to find stability, still carrying more than he could easily explain. Layne saw that and made space for him without hesitation. He invited him to stay where he was living, a place called the Music Bank. The Music Bank wasn't a proper home. It was a rehearsal space that never really slept. Loud, crowded, and rough around the edges. But for over a year, that's where they lived. Two young men sharing whatever they had, space, time, and the small routines that come from trying to survive one day at a time. There was no structure to it, no clear direction. Just the quiet understanding that neither of them had to figure things out alone. What grew out of that wasn't planned. It didn't start with a vision for success or a carefully designed sound. It came from being around each other constantly, from learning each other's rhythms without trying. Their voices began to fit together naturally. Their ideas started to overlap. The music reflected where they were mentally and emotionally, not where they thought they should be. They didn't just make music together. They imprinted on each other, as Cantrell would describe it decades later. Their vocal approach, their harmonic interplay, the very DNA of Alice in Chains, it wasn't designed. It was born from two people being too close to be anything but honest. It was the beginning of something much harder to separate. The rumors. For years, people kept repeating the same idea, that Jerry walked away when things got worse. During the final years, when Layne became withdrawn and rarely seen, support simply disappeared. It is a version that feels easy to follow. One person needed help, the other failed to provide it. Clean, direct, and emotionally satisfying, but incomplete. Another version of the story claimed that there was a complete breakdown between them. By the late 1990s, communication had fully stopped, and the bond that once defined Alice in Chains had completely collapsed. There is some truth hidden inside this version, because tension did exist. There were disagreements about direction, about whether to continue creating music, and about what the future of the band should look like. Layne, dealing with heavy personal struggles, was not in a place to continue in the same way. Jerry, trying to hold on to something that was slipping away, wanted the music to continue. That difference created a distance that became harder to bridge over time. But distance is not the same thing as disappearance. The third rumor is the most severe one. It suggests that Jerry understood how serious things had become and still did not do enough. This version turns the story into a judgment, as if one person had full control over an outcome that involved multiple people, pressures, and internal struggles happening at the same time. What actually happened is more complicated than that. In 1988, when public concern about Layne's condition was growing, Jerry explained in interviews that visits were still happening. The connection had not completely stopped. At the same time, something unexpected occurred. Layne called into a radio program where Jerry was being interviewed. It was not planned. It was not arranged. It was spontaneous. That moment showed something important. Even with distance and difficulty, awareness of each other had not fully disappeared. There were real tensions, though. Both individuals were under pressure, and both were making different choices about how to handle the future. Some sources describe periods where communication was limited or paused, especially during disagreements about the direction of the band. Those disagreements were not small. They reflected two people trying to navigate a situation that was becoming increasingly unstable. But one detail often gets missed in simplified versions of the story. Both sides were struggling at the same time. The idea that one person was stable while the other was falling apart does not fully match what was happening. Jerry later acknowledged that addiction was part of his own life during that period as well. He did not become sober until 2003, which was after Layne's death. That means both were dealing with addiction, pressure, and emotional strain during overlapping years. That changes the entire picture. It was not a situation where one person was watching from safety while the other declined. It was closer to two people moving through instability together, in different ways and at different speeds. When that is understood, the idea of simple blame becomes harder to hold on to. The situation was not defined by a single action or failure. It was shaped by timing, circumstance, and limitations that affected both sides. The feud, the estrangement, and the last song. Some endings don't feel like endings. They feel like something left hanging in the air, waiting for an answer that never comes. That is what makes the later years of Layne Staley and Jerry Cantrell so difficult to explain in a straight line. In the final stretch of Layne's life, there was still music happening in the background, not publicly, not in any visible way, but privately. According to accounts referenced in Alice in Chains, The Untold Story, by David DeSola, there are claims that Layne was still recording at home as late as 2002. One of the songs mentioned in those accounts is believed to have been called Every Day. That detail matters because it changes the picture slightly. It suggests that even in isolation, even in a period where contact with the outside world was minimal, the habit of creating music had not completely stopped. Ideas were still being shaped, sounds were still being put together, and in some form, there was still a connection to the past, including a possible intention to send material to Jerry Cantrell. That connection, even if only creative, had not been fully erased. But the message was never delivered. In April 5, 2002, Layne Staley died in his Seattle apartment. He was not found immediately. Days passed before anyone fully realized what had happened. When the discovery was made, the condition of his health made the situation even harder to process. The contrast between the person who once performed in front of large crowds and the person found in that apartment was extreme, and it left a lasting impact on those closest to him. For Jerry, the news did not arrive as something abstract or distant. It landed directly, without preparation. In later reflections, he described that period as one of the most unstable points in his life. He was already dealing with substance use at the time, and the loss of Layne added another layer of emotional weight that was difficult to separate from everything else happening around him. During this period, work continued on an album called Degradation Trip. The material was not created in a stable environment. It came out of a phase marked by personal difficulty, creative pressure, and emotional exhaustion. Jerry later spoke openly about that time, describing it as a period shaped by substance use and loss, including both the end of Alice in Chains in its original form and Layne's death occurring close together. The album was released shortly after Layne passed away. It was not framed as a celebration or a tribute in a formal sense, but it carried emotional weight tied to that period of transition. It was later dedicated to Layne, adding another layer of meaning to something already created in a very personal state. Another detail from this time stands out because of how ordinary it is on the surface. Jerry took in Layne's cat, Sadie, a Siamese that had been with him during his final years. He cared for the animal until 2010. It is not a dramatic detail, but it is revealing in a different way. It shows continuity in a space where most connections had already been broken or changed. Small responsibilities like that often reflect something deeper than public statements ever can. A year later, in 2003, Jerry became sober. The timing has often been noted because it came relatively soon after Layne's death. It does not point to a single cause, but it does show that something in that period forced a shift. Patterns that had been continuing for years could no longer remain unchanged. The years surrounding that moment were not structured or clear. They were overlapping periods of creation, loss, instability, and adjustment happening at the same time here. Music continued to exist through all of it, but so did disruption. Nothing followed a clean order. What remains after all of this is not a simple narrative of separation or resolution. It is a period where creative work, personal struggle, and emotional connection all existed in the same space without clear boundaries between them. And that is what makes this chapter difficult to compress into easy conclusions. The grief he wore as a physical illness. When Jerry Cantrell came back into public music again with Alice in Chains in 2009, the return was not framed around celebration. It was built around loss. The song Black Gives Way to Blue was written specifically as a farewell to Layne Staley, and Elton John's piano on it made the tone even clearer. This was not recovery music. It was goodbye music. What makes this moment stand out is not only the song itself, but what was happening to Jerry physically while it was being written. He later explained that, during that period, his health started breaking down in ways that could not be easily explained. Severe migraines appeared. Pain became constant. It reached a point where medical testing was required, including a spinal tap, just to rule out serious conditions. No clear medical cause was found. That detail matters because it removes the idea that this was only emotional sadness. The body was reacting in a way that medicine could not fully explain. The experience was physical, not just mental. Something was building internally over time, and it was finally showing up in a way that could not be ignored anymore. Jerry later described it in very direct terms. It felt like grief had been stored for years and was finally coming out in a physical form. Not as a single moment of sadness, but as accumulated pressure. Pain that did not behave like a normal injury. Symptoms that came without a clear source. A sense that something unresolved was forcing its way outward after being held in for too long. Black Gives Way to Blue became the place where that pressure was released into structure. The song does not try to dramatize anything. It moves slowly, with restraint, and it carries a tone that feels more like acceptance than explanation. It is not written to revisit the past. It is written to acknowledge it without trying to change it. That approach becomes more visible when looking at what followed in later years. After 2022, Jerry's work did not behave like a standard continuation of a career. It does not move forward with the same urgency that defined earlier years. Instead, the structure of the music becomes more reflective. The pacing slows. The emotional tone becomes less about expression and more about processing. There is still movement, but it is controlled, not reactive. That shift is not accidental. It aligns with the fact that the creative foundation of Alice in Chains had been built around a dual-voice structure from the beginning. Jerry has explained that many songs were written with multiple vocal layers in mind. Not all of those layers were always performed in full, but they existed in the composition. The writing process itself often included space for more than one voice. That structural habit becomes more noticeable in later work because the layering still exists even when only one singer is present. The songs often feel built with additional space inside them, a harmonic structure that suggests conversation rather than single narration. In 2024, this pattern appears again in Jerry's solo album, I Want Blood. The record was widely recognized by critics, and one of its tracks, Afterglow, stands out because of its emotional restraint. It does not directly reference specific events, but the structure of the song is reflective. It feels like a return to something unfinished rather than a conclusion. The writing does not move toward resolution. It moves toward recognition of what still exists emotionally, even after time has passed. The pacing and tone suggest that some experiences do not close neatly, even after many years of distance. What connects all of this is not symbolism or interpretation layered on top of the music. It is repetition of a pattern across time. Physical symptoms tied to emotional memory, songwriting shaped by absence, and structural choices in music that continue to leave space for more than one voice. That is what makes this chapter different from a typical grief story. It is not about healing as an endpoint. It is about how unresolved experience continues to influence creative output in measurable ways, through health, through composition, and through the way music is built over decades. What Jerry Cantrell has finally confirmed in recent interviews is not a single shocking revelation, but a clearer framing of something that was always there, just not fully understood by the public. Across multiple conversations in 2024 and 2025, his position consistently moves away from simplified narratives and toward something more balanced and uncomfortable. The relationship with Layne Staley was never one-sided in meaning, responsibility, or influence. One of the strongest points he reiterates is that they were creative equals in a way that is often misunderstood. Public storytelling tends to place Layne at the center as the tragic voice and Jerry as the supporting force behind the music. Jerry has pushed back against that idea by explaining that the identity of Alice in Chains came from mutual shaping, not hierarchy. The structure, sound, and emotional weight of the band were built through interaction, not separation of roles. A key part of this confirmation is the idea that Layne directly shaped Jerry as a vocalist. Jerry did not initially set out to be a singer, but Layne's insistence and encouragement pushed him into that role. This is not framed as a side detail in interviews. It is central to how Jerry describes the formation of the band's identity. The dual voice structure that became one of the band's defining features did not emerge from planning. It emerged from necessity and collaboration. He also acknowledges that addiction was not isolated to one person. Earlier public narratives often positioned Layne as the focal point of decline, but Jerry has clarified that substance use existed on multiple sides. The key distinction he makes is not about who struggled more, but about the outcome. Survival did not mean stability or superiority. It meant different timing and different consequences, not control over the situation. Another important confirmation is the ongoing nature of grief. Jerry does not describe loss as something that ended in the past. Instead, he frames it as something that continues to appear in work, memory, and even physical strain. The language he uses in interviews reflects this directly, especially in the way he expresses continued absence without softening it into closure. The phrasing itself signals that the experience remains active rather than resolved. Finally, he addresses a long-running public debate around whether continuing the band after Layne's death was a form of betrayal. His position is direct. Continuation is not erasure. When Alice in Chains reformed with William Duvall, the intention was not to replace or overwrite the past, but to acknowledge what existed while still moving forward. The framing he uses is consistent. Continuing does not cancel memory, and survival does not equal abandonment. Taken together, these confirmations do not rewrite history. They refine it. They replace simplified assumptions with a more layered reality, one where influence was mutual, struggle was shared in different forms, and continuation is not denial of the past, but coexistence with it. One detail still lingers. Layne Staley's cat, Sadie, died in 2010 on the same night Alice in Chains played in Seattle, the city where everything began for Jerry Cantrell and Layne Staley. Jerry found out after the show, a quiet coincidence that never really fades. What once looked like a rumor was always something deeper, a bond that never fully ended. Like and subscribe for more untold rock stories that hit differently.